Welcome back. This is Joel Duff. I got to do one of the things that I most enjoy on my job today, and it inspired me to do a little extra research, and I thought I would spend a little bit of time talking about it. That thing that I got to do was I got to sit at a dissertation defense. I serve on the committees of a number of PhD candidates. I've had my own PhD students, and although that's a privilege to do that, that's also slightly more nerve-wracking since I'm responsible for that particular student. In this case, this was another student that I serve on their committee, and this particular student had been in multiple of my classes as an undergraduate, so I remember her quite well. And she ended up doing some undergraduate research in a lab in our department, and then eventually entered into our PhD program. And now she's seeing the culmination of 6 years of hard work, and what really amazing work it was. And the great thing about a dissertation defense is it's sort of like the end of all that stuff, and now you get to present all the things you've been doing. She's written all of her chapters and she's summarizing them for us. And then the best part, we get to ask her lots of questions, and ask questions we did. And, a good dissertation defense is one where the student is obviously competent and has done a great job. And, I've read the dissertation and really don't have questions that are sort of like at the end, like, oh, well, why did you do this? This isn't worthy work. No, it's more of a celebration of a job well done, and an opportunity to sort of talk about the results and celebrate what has happened, the hard work of that student. And I find these very interesting because it's a way, it's a window into cutting edge research in a variety of different fields, sometimes very far outside of my own. In this case, it's cave biology, and I'm no cave biologist, and I certainly am not interested in doing what she had to do to collect her samples, because I saw a lot of pictures of squeezing through very small spaces, very deep underneath the ground in order to take some water samples in an aquifer more than 500 feet deep in a cave. And I was claustrophobic just being in the room looking at the pictures. But I digress. Here's the story I want to tell you. It has to do with Wind Cave in South Dakota. So in the Black Hills of South Dakota, there's Wind Cave National Park. You see the bison there are roaming around on the ground that's above where this incredible 150 miles of cavernous system is found, in which this research has been done. Here is a diagram of this networked system of caverns. And so you can see it's a little bit like Swiss cheese underneath ground there. And this Swiss cheese-like network is the result of many, many fractures of a limestone layer of rock that was laid down long ago. And after these many fractures, each fracture then began to have the dissolution of the limestone, creating larger and larger cracks over time, or widening cracks over time, eventually leading to the connection of various passageways and ultimately to many different layers of passageways and so forth. So this is a very intricate network, and some of you may have been to Wind Cave. It's a very popular tourist place because it's been very small portions of it have been adapted for easy access for visitors. But if you get off the beaten path, which only some people are allowed to, and in this case having a research permit and doing research in this cave is a great thing, because it allows you to get far down into this cave, far beyond what any average person would be able to do. And all the way down into the very lowest layers of the cave. And at that point, at the very lowest point in the cave, there is a series of lakes. And these lakes, I learned, are part of an aquifer system in the South Dakota, northern Nebraska region. And this aquifer, an aquifer is just water that's stored under the ground, right? Groundwater. And at about 500 feet below the entrance of the cave is you hit the aquifer, you hit the groundwater level. And at that point, you have standing water in the cave because that's where the water is in the rock that continues out far away from where the cave is. And so these pools of water form, and you can have direct access at this point to the aquifer itself. And so these aquifers are used all across, well, in this particular area it's used, but there are other aquifers that are used for irrigation and so forth, right? You drill down and you access the aquifer and then you suck the water out. But even in doing that, you can't quite get, exact pure water resource from when you drill down into this, because essentially you contaminate the water by the drilling operation itself, and you're going through a bunch of other rock above it, like shales and so forth, which are going to, in this particular case, we're interested in the microbes that are found in these caves. And by doing that, you're going to introduce some of the microbes from above into the waters below. But in this case, by going through a very difficult route to get to these lakes that have been very rarely visited and are very carefully guarded in the sense of what you can do down there and what you can bring. Accessing this water allows you to access what we call very primitive water, actually potentially thousands and thousands of years old water in terms of how long it takes for it to percolate through the rock and get to these various lakes. So that's the scene, right? I'm setting the stage. That's the interest in this particular aquifer is knowing something about the types of organisms that may live in that aquifer and live in this particular cave, and then what are how do they survive in these particular conditions, and there are a bunch of other associated questions. All right, so why am I talking about this other than, hey, I've got kind of some neat stuff to tell you about this cave. And of course, I'm interested in all things involving sort of like the origins of things. And as I listened and read about this particular cave, and I became intrigued in like, what is the history of this particular, of this very large cave system? And as I learned, not only from asking questions and being involved in discussion about this particular cave, being part of this dissertation committee, I also, on my own, did a little bit of research and dug into this cave, and I found it has a very complex history. And the first thing I want you to note in terms of the complexity, and the thing that I actually noted that got me the most interested in this cave with respect to the question of the age of the Earth and the types of things that we talk about here on this channel, is you notice the bottom part of this figure shows a cross section of the cave. The top section is kind of like looking down on the network of the cave system, but the bottom figure there is over down there, right, is the cross section of the layer of the Madison Formation, which is the limestone rock that this cave is dissolved into, I guess you could call it. And you'll notice that the cave is not horizontal. You see that? The cave formation is tilted. Okay, so the major chambers in this cave formation are slanted downward, and you might say, well, maybe that's because of the way that the rock fractures or the way the rock layers are set in, so they're going to dissolve this way or erode this way as running water moves through there. And there is a sense in which that can happen. You can get non-vertical structures or cave formations because of the nature of the rock itself. But in this case, that's not exactly what's happened here. In this case, what has happened here is, the original limestone would have been laid down horizontally, right? I mean, there's plenty of, that's a simple geological principle of stratification, that these limestone layers would have been laid down shallow sea, where you have a lot of evaporation going on and so forth, and you end up with this thick band of limestone laid down horizontally, and then you have layers of rock laid on, layers of sediment on top of that. You notice there's a little wavy line on the top of the Madison Formation, and that's because it's thought that after this limestone was laid down and a little bit of sediment started to form on top of that, that erosion began to, that just kind of sat there for a long time, and then this limestone began to actually experience some erosion. So there was some cracking, fracturing of the limestone, and then you had the beginnings of little of water being able to move through this limestone rock and begin to erode out some of the linear chambers in there. This all would have happened when it was horizontal. And part of the reason we know that's horizontal is because you can look at the roofs and the other, you can look at various areas where things have precipitated and see that they eroded and precipitated while in a horizontal orientation. So now, why is it all tipped up? Well, much later in time, so after, I'm getting ahead of myself. This cave is really complex. And I'm going to simplify the story. It's going to sound complex. After the limestone's laid down, then you had some fracturing the limestone, the beginning of some cave formation. You have essentially what's called karst formation. So like in China and other areas where you have kind of collapsing of the limestone into caverns. During that interval, then when there was another layer of sediment that later began to be laid down on top of this, right? So the wavy line there represents sort of this nonconformity where you don't have an instantaneous layer on top. You have an eroded layer. And then when the next set of sediments that were to appear there were laid down on top of that, some of those got dragged down into the very early cave system that existed. And that, very interestingly, those sediments were actually like red sandstone, more like sandstone material. And shales, but the red material is the most important, because that you can see apparently in the cave there are portions of the cave that have been filled in, right, with this red material, this red matrix, and then later that's been eroded out. So that red matrix gets in and then turns into rock itself, and then that has to be eroded, and so you're actually eroding several different things inside the cave at later intervals. The point of all this description is to give you the sense that the formation of Wind Cave is really a series of events. You could call it the evolution of this particular cavern system is complex. It's just not just two things happen. You don't have limestone and then you have cave form. You have a whole sequence of events. So now I have to get to the tipping part, right? So later, after all this sediment was piled up on top of the limestone layer, forming a bunch of different layers of rock on top of that, including a bunch of shale on top of it, and then you've got your other sandstones above that even further, you then had a geological uplift of that area, right? If you've been to South Dakota, you know it's kind of flat over most of the state, and then when you get to the western side, you've got the Black Hills. That whole area is kind of pushed up, and so the act of pushing up and bulging up that area results in the tipping up of this entire set of limestone, and so the cave itself, or what was the portions of the cave that were there at that time, get all tipped up. Now, as it tips up, this whole thing is essentially full of water. It's all below below the water level. All right, and so this whole limestone would have been saturated at this point. And then as it gets topped up, well, then it starts to drain out. Right, the upper portion now becomes above the water. I'm trying to remember what the word, the water line. All right, and And so it begins to dry out, but you still have some liquid getting in from above and dripping through there, and that begins to form what you might typically think of as cave formation type things, at least the things you like to see in caves, right? The stalactites and stalagmites and other interesting formations. A lot of that really is missing in a good portion of Wind Cave because of the fact that a lot of it was formed while it's underwater or in water, and therefore you don't get the dripping stuff, which is what most people associate with caves. Actually, why don't I show you a couple of pictures? Yeah, so there's an interesting formation in this cave, and again, like, this is not the most ornate, beautiful picture of the cave, but it illustrates, again, the complexity of the cave, because these sheets above here, up at the top here, are thin little layers of calcite, and that calcite material is a precipitated mineral. But now you had this. So where did they get these little flat sheets? And this is they're called the box formation. So here. Why is it called the box formation? Because when you look up at the ceiling, you see things like this. All right, it looks kind of like a spider web, but some of them are very, very elongated. And presumably these would have been, go all the way down to the floor at some point. Because what do these little thin sheets represent? These thin sheets of calcite, they represent the cracks that existed in the limestone in the past. Right? So the limestone cracks, and after it cracks, and water seeps into the crack, right, into the fracture, then water brings in the material that makes up this calcite. It precipitates in the crack. And so that forms this thin sheet, right, of precipitated material. Now, it turns out the calcite itself is more resistant to erosion than the limestone around it that was the material that had cracked. And so later on, over a long period of time, I'm talking about a really long period of time, but the limestone continues to dissolve as it sits in groundwater, but the calcite is more resistant to dissolution. And so therefore, the limestone around it disappears, and you're left with the thin sheets. And so you have all these little thin sheets, and every little thin sheet of calcite that you see, so again here, every thin little piece of calcite that you see here was originally cracks in the limestone that were filled with that material, and then later the limestone was dissolved out. You see how this represents a series of events then, right? You had to have the limestone form, and then I want to emphasize too that the limestone, when it was laid down, had to harden, right? It had to harden to the point where it could fracture, right? It's not going to happen when it's soft sediments. It has to itself harden. And then after the fracturing, you then had to have the calcite formation, which requires certain minerals in the water. Then you had to have continued dissolution of the limestone itself, resulting in the product you see today. Right? And then when you head all the way down into, turn me off, when you head all the way down to the bottom of the cave, we find these beautiful clear pools down there. And the really neat thing about the research that I heard about, participate in today, was that these waters are have some of the, how should I put this? They're some of the most devoid of life water found on Earth. There's only a few other locations that have been sampled on Earth that have fewer cells in them, living things. And there are bacteria that live this far down in the cave. And the bacteria have very unique properties. I'll just leave it at that. There's only so much I can say about this research because it's going to be published in hopefully a very good journal in the near future. And there's some really fascinating stuff about the biogeochemistry that goes on here, how these different bacteria survive without any sunlight. and without traditional sources of carbon and so forth. And so there's some really interesting bioenergetic systems going on in these caves in the very few cells that exist. There's even viruses down here. So a very interesting ecology in these lakes, and considered to be a very old ecology. The water itself, the thing I learned about the water is considered very old. You might be thinking, well, like, what makes water old? All water has dissolved minerals and other things in it, and they represent, and there's different isotopes, radioactive isotopes in water. And anything that's near the surface picks up on certain kinds of isotope. It's water anywhere near the surface of the earth will pick up certain isotopes of elements that are being produced by cosmic rays, ultraviolet light, and other things striking the earth and generating certain isotopes. A lot of these are fairly short-lived isotopes, meaning they only live for thousands of years, or maybe tens of thousands of years. And so any water that is experienced any area near the surface of the earth will have some amount of these isotopes. But the longer that the water is in the ground, farther away from the surface, and as it seeps down and it gradually gets into this aquifer, and by the time it makes its way into a place like these particular lakes, that water has spent an enormous amount of time potentially making its trip. And one of the ways you know that it's taken a long time is by measuring the isotope ratios in the water, and you find out that they're very, very low on isotopes that would be a much higher concentration in waters closer to the surface. And so that's how you can say this is very old water. So potentially tens of thousands of years old type of water. Now you can see where I'm going with several of these lines of thought, right? All these things are pointing to something. They're pointing to the fact that this is rather difficult to explain within a 4,500 year global flood that produced this rock. How would you have this series of events? Maybe I'll bring up this next slide first, right? How would you get... So here, this is Timothy Clary from Institutes for Creation Research, and this was the only person I could find that commented on Wind Cave at all. All right, so as far as I can tell, young Earth creationists haven't dealt with this particular cave. They've talked a lot about other caves, and they usually have very simple explanations for caves. And the origins of caves. I think they recognize that caves are kind of a challenge, right, to the young Earth creationist paradigm, because almost all caves on Earth must be formed sometime at the very end of a global flood, because the caves are found in rocks that were made by the global flood, so therefore their origin can't be before the flood. So then you have to have the rock itself that the cave is in has to have formed. It has to have, the rock has to have formed completely before you can then begin to dissolve that rock to form a cave. And so usually those are post-flood processes, which would be sometime after 4,500 years ago. So there's not very much time to create a cave. And then some caves have rock art in them or something like that that's, very, very old. And how do you explain that? I don't know in most cases. But this particular cave really struck me as especially difficult to explain. Here is just Timothy Clary's statement here. They talk about taking a tour. This enormous cave system has developed late in the flood as massive volumes of acid-laden water drained through fractures, dissolving passages in the uplifted limestone beds. That makes it sound really simple. Right, there was this flood that created this limestone. One thing, making limestone is not that easy, and also making limestone of certain purity when it's surrounded by shale above it and sandstones and other forms of rock below, which are very different in their chemical composition. That's, to me, mind-boggling to explain within the confines of a single catastrophic flood. But putting that aside, let's say you had the limestone, it also has to form to the extent that it is able to fracture. And even if it was fractured a little bit, they would have to then claim that you dissolved most of the chambers within a period of a few weeks or something, or a few months, before the whole thing was then uplifted. And then what I didn't point out was the cave does have stalagmites and stalactites and so forth in other parts of the cave that are drier, where all you have is precipitation from above. And all of that had to form much more recently. And then how do you explain the old water that's at the base? If you just had rushing water, passing through this at high rates, well, that water can't be more than a couple thousand years old. That's at the base of those in those lakes or in the aquifer system. And also, I told you that the limestone seems to have dissolved somewhat, forming some caverns, which then, when rock was precipitated or material was placed on top of that, deposited on top of that, infilled portions of the cave system that were present at the time, creating rocks from that sediment inside the cave. Now, I'm not sure how you explain that in a global flood, right? If the global flood is laying down the limestone, and then immediately, within days or hours or maybe a week at the most, it's laying down the next layers of shales that are above it, and then all being compacted, and then you have to have this weight on top of it in order to compact it into rock. That compaction also, it squeezes a lot of the water out of it too. I don't know where you get the cracks and then the ability to actually make caverns and then somehow have material from above it, which isn't rock yet, come down into those caverns, and then become rock inside those caverns. There's just no room for that in this global flood scenario. The fractures were created while the Black Hills and the rest of the Rocky Mountains were being thrust upward in the early Cenozoic. Well, now that's wrong there. I don't know where they thought it was the early Cenozoic, because the limestone itself is far older than that. The upthrust might have taken place at that time. And they also talk about how this is the same limestone layer that's found all the way in the Grand Canyon. And that's not actually accurate either. I don't know who looked that up, but this is much, much older limestone. And it is found in the Grand Canyon, but it's not Cenozoic rock. It is rock that they would consider to be part of a global flood as well. I don't know if that made any sense, but all right, if you really know your flood geology, you'll kind of get what I'm talking about here. So that's a bit of the story of Wind Cave. And this dissertation was really great because it had a little bit of geology in it, so I was really fascinated in that. The continuing production or the continuing evolution of the cave itself. I don't know if you saw in that picture earlier. This is where the current water level is now. The aquifer level right now is, but you can see these lighter layers up here. That's precipitates from that. And theirs are precipitates of really weird chemicals, by the way. I can't say anything more than that. So, because the biogeochemistry is sort of the really significant portion of her dissertation that's yet to be published. And also the whole bacterial community thing in there. So she actually extracted DNA from the organisms in a large quantity of the water from this aquifer, and then found out what kind of organisms are living there, and then looked at all the genes from those organisms in order to try to figure out the types of things they're capable of doing in terms of their metabolism. And that's what helps lead you to understanding what exactly are they living on? It's how are they living together And then how are they surviving in a place that you would think would have extremely little food, especially considering what I told you about the age of the water in this location. It's not as if water is just, it's not like bison 500 feet above are urinating and then various phosphates and uric acid and so forth are seeping down through the rock and then dripping into this cavern, providing nitrogen and resources for organisms to live on. No, that's not happening. There really isn't any ground. There isn't any water from above that's in any layer of rock above that's making it all the way down here. This water is coming from water that's seeping down probably tens or hundreds of miles away, maybe to the north, and then eventually working its way along this layer of limestone that has more room for water to move through, and eventually it's made it to this point where it appears in these particular lakes. And so that road is so long, and there are so many other organisms. I know you might look at places like this and think they're dead, but everywhere underneath the ground you're going to find microbes and bacteria, fungi too sometimes, viruses. There's life there. And all that life has to find a way to survive by using energy sources. And so anything that's coming to these organisms has had a long trip. And during that long trip, they've encountered a whole bunch of other organisms that will take away the easy food. All right, will gobble up the easy stuff. And so it's not going to leave them with a whole lot of nutrients. And so they're going to probably have to use something that's native in that actual environment, some kind of mineral that exists in the rocks themselves. And that's sort of the real interesting, new world that's being discovered right now. And that's why this student's right on the cutting edge, and this lab is on the cutting edge of discovering really interesting, quirky organisms that can do things in very different ways than we're used to thinking of life operating. And so there's a book called The Deep Hot Biosphere, which refers to deep down in the earth, where it's actually even warmer because of the heat from the mantle, and the weird ways that organisms survive there. Or maybe you might think of way down at the bottom of the ocean, those hot vents, where you've got all kinds of noxious chemicals that are seeping out from the mantle or deep down in the earth, and these hot liquids, and yet there are organisms that thrive there and survive without the sun. And they find energy in other ways besides getting it from the sun. And so that's breaks the dogma of 100 years ago, where all living things on Earth are essentially obtaining their energy from sunlight. Even though I'm not directly obtaining it from sunlight, I'm eating a plant or I'm eating something else that did get their energy from sunlight. And so this is just another place where, hey, the sun don't shine down here. And so organisms have to find a way to live. And they've been finding ways to live in very interesting ways. And like I said, I can't tell you right now what those are. So it's kind of disappointing, but that's the way it is. Hey, maybe in another year, I'll be able to talk about this paper and her work in more detail, because it's really fascinating stuff. All right, that's my story of what I did today. Spent a couple hours just talking science and hearing about science, and like I said before, that's kind of the fun part of this job, is to see students learn and to see them become peers, because at the end of the day, I get to call her doctor, and for the first time, and that's really fun. And to see an undergraduate who was always a good undergraduate, but to see how much she's learned along the way and how she's changed over that time is a really fantastic experience. And so I want to congratulate her. I'm not going to use her name here on YouTube, but maybe I'll send her this video so at least she knows that I've talked about her and she inspired me to make this video. Although I think she had any idea I was going to talk about Noah's flood. That probably wasn't right on the tip of her mind when I asked her some questions about what she knew about the origin of this particular cave. But I'm always intrigued. I know I just keep going on and on, don't I? I'm always fascinated or intrigued, or I like to ask people they're not thinking about that at all, right? They're not thinking about those types of questions about origins. They might not be aware of controversies about young Earth, old Earth. Actually, it's not controversial really, but controversies within the church about old Earth and young Earth. And I like to ask them questions that to get sort of their honest feeling about like what they see in the evidence and what they've heard and how they think about it. I know some students know that, they've probably spread the rumor around that I am prone to asking some questions on comprehensive exams that are like throwing out a piece of young Earth creationist material that may be related to their work, but has a contrary position, but not really telling them who wrote it. They might not have any idea who it is, but then asking them to reflect upon that work. Like, tell me how would you critique this? Like, in your experience, what you know, how would you respond to this material? And to see if they can pull out the same kind of errors that I see in that work, even though they don't have like this. I mean, you could say they have a bias, but they don't have the same kind of bias where they're intentionally looking to knock down a particular theory. They just see it as, okay, this is somebody's hypothesis. Does it have merit? And based on all these different things I'm seeing, and I'm doing active research in this particular field, and I'm seeing the data myself, how do I respond when I see somebody saying something that just sounds like they're trying to explain it in a completely different way? Can it possibly make sense at all, or not? And those are always interesting reflections because it makes students really ponder and think about their own data and their own evidence. All right, I'm going to sign off because I'm going off on too many tangents now. But hey, if you're still here, thanks for listening. Again, my name's Joel Duff, and it's been great talking to you. We'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.